So now that we have a functioning simulation system, we can go ahead and automate the system so that it runs all the city blocks, in this case 70 of them, in sequence. We just have to make sure that it actually uses the variety that we give it. So in our case, we have 3 commercial clusters, 3 house clusters. We have got blocks that are designated for houses and blocks designated for commercial buildings. And we have to make sure that this actually comes through in our simulation. And we have to make sure that we make a few changes so that it actually does that. Let's just quickly clean up our node chain a little bit, lay it out a bit more neatly. Let's go back up to object level and dive into city blocks. Because we'll later on be using a wedge ROP to change this setting, the group, to change the block, we're going to have a parameter to change like that, and that is actually obvious what it's changing. So let's go into edit parameter interface. And above the group, let's insert an integer. Make sure that's above it. Let's call it block underscore number. And as label, just block number with capitals. Hit enter so that it picks up and leave it there. And if you want to be really precise, we know that we have 70 blocks. So we could set the range here from 0 to 69. And that way the slider that it provides will have 70 options. Let's hit apply and accept. I'll have to do that off screen. There we go. So now we can pull this block number value into the group value, and we can use a wedge ROP to change this value. In the BLAST node, in a group node, you can always say @name is equal to block underscore, and then we want to have an expression in here. So we use a backtick, and I always like to finish with a backtick as well, just to make sure that the expression part is in between the backticks. Let's call a channel, and that's the channel we just created. So open and close brackets, and the channel we're calling in between quotation marks is block number. It's already suggesting it, block number, and hit enter. And now we should have block 0 back. You can see in the viewport it changed. And if we change this back to 10, we will have the block we just had. So that seems to be working. So now if we change this setting with a wedge ROP, it should trickle down into the simulation. Let's just make sure that we give it a name as well that we can recognize. So instead of BLAST 3, let's call it isolate underscore city block. And I want to make it purple, just so it's obvious that it does something. Also, before I had it underneath the out node, I'm not sure you still have it there, but if you have it underneath the out, make sure that it's above. I'm just going to make one small change. I'm going to change this to block num instead of block number. And that means I also have to do that in the parameter interface. Block num. The label we can leave, that should be fine. Apply and accept. And make sure that this is back at 10. And that works again, perfect. Let's also make a few changes in our building clusters node. Make sure that we have the final out node here selected. Jump back up to object level. In my case, it's cooking again because I've changed the blocks a few times. And jump back into building clusters. So we still have one switch node, but we want to change that. We want to have one switch node for each. So let's just move this to the left and duplicate these two. And let's disconnect them from each other. So disconnect the commercial from the houses and vice versa. There we go. Let's call this, instead of out cluster, let's call it out houses. And let's call this one out commercial. Let's rename this switch to switch houses cluster. And let's rename the other switch to switch underscore commercial cluster. And it's asking for input 3, but it only has 3, so that goes from 0 to 2. Let's just change it to 2 so that we no longer have an error message on it. So now we have 3 times houses, 3 times commercial, in between which we can differentiate, and we have that filler cluster right there. And also please note that when we're looking at these switch nodes, we're not actually setting any channels in here, but we're going to be using Python to set these remotely from another node. And again, if you want to make things easy for yourself, use the same names I'm using, because I'll be using some of these in my code. Let's go back into our simulation node. So city block sim, back to object level, and into city block sim. And here we'll make a number of changes again. So one change we're making is this import chain. Instead of having 1, we're now going to need 2 because we split up the houses and the commercial nodes. So let's just duplicate this chain and add a switch in between. Let's call it switch underscore cluster type. And of course we want to be calling the correct nodes. So in import buildings, let's call it import houses. And the other one, let's call it import commercial. And let's look at the imports. So we're doing the entire cluster. Let's find the out node for the houses, out houses. And here we want to find out commercial. There we go. Also note that instead of an op expression, we now have a relative path instead. It doesn't matter which one you're using so long as you're getting the clusters that you need. Now to drive some of these nodes, we're going to have to add a Python script, and we're going to add it just underneath import city blocks because I want it to run first thing. Let's put down the Python node and just put it in between. Make sure that both of these connectors are coming out of the Python 1 node, and let's write some code in here. Let's expand this top window. At the top, I want to import the random module, and that's because I'm going to be using the random function to choose between commercial block 1, 2, and 3, or 0, 1, and 2, and house block 0, 1, and 2. So let's start with a hashtag line so that we know what we're writing. So first we're going to get the block type, and then we're going to set the import switches. Underneath there, we're going to initialize a few values. Block underscore type is undefined, and this is going to be a string. So first I'm going to set it to undefined, and then later we're going to change that. And we're going to put a number in there as well, block underscore type underscore num. And I'm using -1 there because 0 will actually be the first input of something. So to avoid using 0 as the first input, where it might be 1 or 2, we're initializing to -1. Now let's make a for loop over all the points. For point in geo.points, and with a colon, block type is point.attrib value, and in between the brackets we have block type in quotation marks. So now if we would look at our imports, in this case we have city block. If we look at the properties, we should have a string value in there, and the string value is called block type, and the value connected to is commercial. It can also be houses. But in order to set the switches, we cannot set a switch to commercial or houses. We can only set it to 0 or 1 or 2, etc. We're going to convert that value, that string value, into a number. Let's expand this window again a bit, and let's write the code that's going to do that. And that's going to go if block type is equal to houses, and the houses is a string, so we're using quotation marks, colon, block type num is 0. We can also say elif, so else if block type is equal to commercial, and with a colon, again 4 spaces indentation or 1 tab, block type num is 1. If none of this is true, pass. So that would simply ignore that block of code and run by it. So if we click on our node network, we see that the Python node is still not erroring out, so that this code actually works. So now comes the trick. We can then use this block type number, or this block type num value that we've created, and we can set the switch to that number. Let's do that in the next clip.